If I showed you a 2024 F-150, a 2024 Silverado, and a 2024 Ram 1500 from a distance, could you tell them apart? Maybe. But I'd bet a lot of you would have to actually think about it for a second. And that's kind of insane when you consider how much brand loyalty exists in the truck world. Like, truck people are not subtle about which brand they drive. They will tell you. Repeatedly. Without being asked. And yet the actual trucks are becoming harder and harder to tell apart at a glance. So what happened? How did the most brand-loyal segment in the entire automotive market end up with the most visually similar products? That's what we're getting into today. And just to set expectations, this isn't really a hate video. I'm not here to tell you trucks are ugly or that the manufacturers are lazy or whatever. It's more of a genuine question about how this happened, because it's actually a pretty interesting story when you dig into it. There are real reasons why trucks converged on the same look, and some of those reasons make total sense. And some of them are a little depressing depending on how much you care about automotive design, which I do. So let's get into it. To understand where we are now, you kind of have to understand where trucks were maybe 30 years ago, because the contrast is pretty stark. If you look at a 1995 F-150 next to a 1995 C/K Silverado next to a 1995 Dodge Ram, those are three genuinely different-looking vehicles. Not just in the badge and the trim level, in the actual shape and proportions and design language. The old square-body GM trucks had this very boxy utilitarian look that was almost agricultural. The Ford F-Series of that era had a slightly more refined shape, but still very clearly its own thing. And then Dodge did something kind of bold in 1994 with the Ram redesign. They went big and aggressive with a front end that was inspired by semi-trucks, with this massive hood and in-your-face proportions. People thought it was ugly at first, and then it sold really well, and then everyone sort of took notes. That Ram redesign is actually a really important moment in this story because it was one of the last times a truck manufacturer made a genuinely risky design decision and had it pay off in a big way. The 1994 Ram looked like nothing else on the road. It was polarizing, it was bold, and it basically proved that truck buyers would respond to something visually distinctive if it communicated the right things: toughness, size, capability. The problem is that when everyone learns the same lesson from the same success story, they all start moving in the same direction. And that's kind of what happened over the next 2 decades. Now, the first really clear symptom of the convergence problem is what I'd call the front-end situation. Somewhere around the early to mid-2000s, every truck manufacturer landed on basically the same front-end formula: big yacht, grille, wide stance, squared-off hood, aggressive headlights that angle inward, heavy chrome or dark chrome detailing across the grille bars. And again, I understand why this happened. That combination of design elements communicates exactly what truck buyers want the truck to communicate. It looks tough. It looks capable. It looks expensive in a rugged kind of way. The market research probably confirmed it 100 times over. But when every manufacturer is solving for the same brief and landing on the same answer, you end up with a showroom where you need to read the badge to know which brand you're looking at. The Ram has those split headlights, which are actually somewhat distinctive if you're paying attention. The F-150 has a slightly more upright front face. The Silverado went through that period with the controversial headlights that were too high up and honestly looked strange. They fixed it, but it was rough for a while. But fundamentally, the face formula is the same across all of them. Rectangular grille, angry eyes, wide and imposing. That's the truck face now. Everyone agreed on the truck face. The second reason trucks started looking the same is less obvious, but maybe more fundamental, and it has to do with size. Trucks have grown enormously over the last 25 years. The average half-ton pickup is significantly larger today than it was in the late 90s. Longer, wider, taller, heavier. And here's the thing about that. As trucks got bigger, the proportional differences between manufacturers shrank. When one truck has a slightly shorter wheelbase or a slightly different cab height, those differences are visually meaningful. They change the silhouette. They affect how the truck carries itself. But when every half-ton is basically the same massive slab of steel, the proportions converge and the silhouette stops being a useful identifier. Your eye needs something other than the overall shape to tell the brands apart. And if the detail-level design language isn't strong enough to do that job on its own, the trucks start blending together. There's also a regulatory dimension to this that doesn't get talked about enough. Safety regulations around pedestrian impact, crash standards, visibility requirements. These all push manufacturers towards similar solutions because there are only so many ways to meet the same set of requirements while still making a truck that looks like a truck. It's the same phenomenon that made cars start looking like jellyfish in the 90s when aerodynamics became a priority. The physics of the problem just kind of selects for certain shapes. With trucks, the regulations are somewhat different, but the principle is the same. There's a design space that satisfies the requirements, and everyone is working within it. And the overlap in that space is pretty large. Now I want to talk about something that I think is genuinely underappreciated as a driver of this problem, which is consumer research. Manufacturers spend an enormous amount of money on clinics and surveys and focus groups trying to figure out exactly what truck buyers want. And what they find, pretty consistently across brands, is that truck buyers want the truck to look tough, look capable, and look like a truck. Not surprising. But here's the issue. That feedback is essentially identical across all the major brands, which means every design team is working off functionally the same brief. Build something that looks tough and capable and like a truck. And when you give the same brief to multiple talented design teams with similar constraints and similar tooling and similar regulatory requirements, you're going to get similar results. That's not a failure of creativity. That's just how problem-solving works. The problem was baked into the brief. And I think it's worth sitting with that for a second, because I see a lot of commentary online that frames this as a laziness problem. Like the designers just stopped trying or the executives stopped caring. And I don't think that's fair or accurate. If you look at the actual design teams at Ford and GM and Ram, these are genuinely talented people doing interesting work. The problem isn't talent. It's the system that talent is operating inside. When you have a product doing the volume that the F-Series does, the design process becomes incredibly risk-averse at every level. A designer might propose something genuinely new, and it gets softened in the first review. Then it gets softened again in the second review. Then the focus group comes back with mixed results, and it gets softened again. By the time something reaches production, it's been through so many rounds of consensus building that the original idea is barely recognizable. That's not unique to trucks. It happens across the industry. But in the truck segment, it's more pronounced because the stakes are higher. Nobody wants to be the design director who tanked the F-Series. So you make safe calls. And safe calls made consistently across an entire segment produce a very predictable result. There's a really interesting counterexample here that I think makes this point clearly, which is the Ford Maverick. The Maverick came out in 2021, and it is genuinely different from everything else in the truck segment. It's smaller, obviously, but it's also just designed differently. The front end is softer. The proportions are more car-like. It doesn't have the aggressive face formula. It doesn't try to look like it could tow a building. and it sold incredibly well, particularly to buyers who had never purchased a truck before. People who needed the utility but didn't want the visual aggression of a full size. The Maverick proved that there's an audience for a different kind of truck design. The manufacturers just aren't going after that audience with their mainstream products, because the mainstream products are making too much money doing what they're already doing. Which brings me to what I think is the honest core of the answer here, and it's probably not a satisfying one. Trucks look the same because the current formula sells millions of units a year, and nobody wants to be the one who broke it. The F-Series is the best-selling vehicle in the United States. Not the best-selling truck, the best-selling vehicle. Full stop, for over 40 years running. The Ram and the Silverado are fighting for second place, but they're both doing enormous numbers. There is no commercial incentive to take a meaningful design risk in this segment. When your product is selling at that volume, the risk-reward calculation for doing something genuinely different is just really bad. If the gamble pays off, you maybe steal a few points of market share. If it doesn't pay off, you potentially alienate an incredibly loyal customer base who will absolutely buy a competitor's truck to spite you. So you stay in the lane. You iterate slowly. You make the headlights a bit different and the grille a bit bigger and the chrome a bit darker, and you call it a new generation. And look, I'm not saying that's wrong from a business perspective. It's completely rational. But it does mean that the most competitive vehicle segment in North America is also kind of the most visually stagnant one right now, which is a strange thing to sit with. Let's talk about the brands individually for a second, because I don't want to just paint everyone with the same brush. There are differences. They're just more subtle than they used to be. Ford has actually done some interesting things with the F-150 in recent generations. The current generation has this very squared-off, almost architectural side profile that's pretty distinctive once you notice it. The way the character lines work on the body side is actually pretty thoughtful. And Ford has been smart about using the Lightning and the Raptor as design halo vehicles. The Raptor especially has a front end that's clearly a step beyond the standard F-150 in terms of visual aggression, and it gives the whole lineup a performance identity that the Silverado and Ram don't quite match. So Ford, I'd say, is probably doing the best job of maintaining some kind of differentiated identity within the current formula. Ram is interesting because they were the disruptors in 1994, and now they're kind of in the middle of the pack, design-wise. The split headlight signature is genuinely distinctive, and I think they deserve credit for sticking with it across generations. That kind of consistency is actually how brand identity gets built over time. The interior quality has been a talking point for Ram for a while. And the Laramie and Longhorn trim levels have this premium identity that the exterior design doesn't fully communicate, which is a bit of a mismatch. The TRX is a great-looking truck, though. When Ram goes to an extreme, they tend to do it well. The Silverado has had kind of a rough decade design-wise. The previous generation had those high-mounted headlights that were polarizing in a bad way. Not the good kind of polarizing where half the people love it and half hate it, but the kind where most people just thought it looked off. The current generation fixed a lot of that, but it still feels like it's playing catch-up a little. The ZR2 is probably the best-looking current Silverado to me. But again, that's a halo vehicle doing work that the mainstream lineup isn't quite doing on its own. Toyota's Tundra deserves a mention because the current generation made a really interesting design choice that I don't think got enough credit. The new Tundra has this very geometric, almost brutalist front end, lots of sharp angles, a very structured grille, an overall design language that's genuinely different from the Big Three formula. It's divisive. A lot of people think it's ugly, but it's identifiable, which is more than you can say for some of its competitors. And that's actually worth something. Being ugly but distinctive is better than being generic. At least people are talking about it. Nissan's Frontier and Titan are worth mentioning mostly as a cautionary tale. The Frontier went through an extraordinarily long production run with almost no design updates, like embarrassingly long. And when the redesign finally came, it looked fine, but it landed with basically no cultural impact. The Titan has similar energy. They're not bad trucks, but they have almost no design identity in either direction. Nobody loves the way they look. Nobody hates the way they look. Nobody talks about them. Which in some ways is the worst outcome you can have in this segment, where passion and tribalism are the whole product. I want to take a quick detour here and talk about trucks from outside North America. If you look at the Toyota Hilux, which is the dominant truck in basically every market that isn't the United States, it has this really distinct design identity that's almost the opposite of the American formula. It's smaller, it's more purposeful looking. It doesn't try to be imposing. The proportions communicate capability without screaming at you about it. And the Hilux has been one of the best-selling vehicles on the planet for decades because of that design philosophy. Or look at the Mercedes X-Class. Short-lived, I know, but the idea of a truck that communicated premium without going down the chrome and aggression route was genuinely interesting. It didn't work commercially, but the design thinking behind it was different. The Ford Ranger in international markets is actually a good example too. The International Ranger has always had a slightly different design sensibility than the American full-size trucks. A bit more restrained, a bit more European in its proportions. And it's enormous globally. So there's clearly an appetite for trucks. Design that doesn't follow the American formula. It just exists outside the American market. Which raises a question that I don't have a great answer to. Is the aggressive face formula something American truck buyers actually want, or is it something they've been given so consistently that it's become what they expect? Because those are different things. And the answer matters a lot for where truck design goes from here. Now the conversation I really want to have is about electric trucks, because this is where things get genuinely interesting. When Ford and GM and Rivian and Tesla were designing electric trucks, they faced a version of the blank page problem that conventional truck manufacturers haven't faced in years. Electric drivetrains don't need the same front-end packaging as combustion engines. You don't need a massive grille for cooling in the same way. The hood can be lower or shorter. The proportions can be different. There was a real design opportunity here to break from the formula in ways that the combustion trucks couldn't. And the results of what different manufacturers did with that opportunity are pretty revealing. Ford's answer with the Lightning was essentially to make it look like an F-150. And you know what? I understand the logic. The F-150 has an incredibly strong brand identity, and you don't mess with that. Buyers who want a Lightning probably want it to look like a truck they already trust. It's commercially conservative, but arguably correct. The design differences from a regular F-150 are subtle. The sealed front-end treatment, some different lighting elements, but from a distance it's clearly just an F-150, which is fine, but it's not particularly exciting. Rivian did something actually interesting. The R1T has a design language that feels like it came from a different universe than the big three trucks. It's clearly a truck. The proportions are right. The capability reads correctly. But it doesn't borrow from any established truck design vocabulary. The front end has this clean geometric look with a light bar across the full width. The overall silhouette is distinctive. Whether you like it or not, you know what it is when you see it. And for a brand that's trying to establish itself against deeply entrenched competitors, having a truly distinctive design is actually a significant asset. People recognize Rivians because there's nothing else that looks like a Rivian. And then there's the Cybertruck, which is its own entire conversation. Tesla went so far in the opposite direction from the conventional truck formula that the Cybertruck barely looks like a vehicle, let alone a truck. The straight edges, the stainless steel, the total rejection of any organic curves. It's genuinely unlike anything else on the road. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's beautiful because I don't think it is. But it is distinctive in a way that nothing else in the segment is, and in a world where every other truck looks like every other truck, that counts for something. It's also selling. Not in F-150 numbers, obviously, but people are buying it. The Silverado E5 is probably the most interesting data point in this electric truck conversation, because GM had the same blank page opportunity as everyone else, and they used it to make something that looks like a slightly more angular conventional Silverado. Which again, I get the logic. The Silverado has brand equity. You don't want to throw that away. But the contrast with what Rivian and Tesla did with the same opportunity is pretty striking. GM basically said, let's not risk the brand identity. And Rivian basically said, let's build the brand identity from scratch. And Tesla said, let's make something that looks like a kitchen appliance designed by someone who has never seen a truck. And all three approaches have their merits, honestly, which just goes to show that there's no single right answer to the design problem. There's just different levels of risk tolerance. So where does all of this leave us? I think the honest summary is that trucks look the same because the market pressure to look the same is overwhelming, and the market pressure to look different is pretty weak. The people who are going to buy an F-150 are going to buy an F-150. The people who are going to buy a Ram are going to buy a Ram. Very few people are switching brands because of design, and the manufacturers know this. Design in the truck segment serves retention more than conquest. So the smart move is to keep the design familiar enough that your existing customers feel validated and different enough that they have something to talk about when they're comparing trim levels. And that calculus produces pretty incremental design decisions generation after generation. There's one more angle on this I want to cover before I wrap up, which is the trim level problem. Because one thing that's happened in the truck segment over the last 15 years is that the trim level differentiation has become almost more important than the model differentiation. The gap between a base F-150 and a Platinum F-150 is visually enormous. Different wheels, different grille finish, different lighting treatments, different overall visual weight. And the same is true at Ram, with the difference between a base tradesman and a limited. Or at Chevy between a work truck and a high country. Manufacturers have basically pushed their design ambition down into the premium trim levels and left the base trucks looking pretty utilitarian, which makes business sense. The high trim trucks have much better margins, and that's where the design investment is going to be most visible to the buyer who's actually going to notice it. But it also means that when you see a truck in traffic, you don't just have to identify the brand. You have to identify the trim level to get the full picture, and that's a lot of work for a glance. The trucks that look interesting are the ones that cost $70,000. The trucks that look generic are the ones at the price point most people can actually afford. And I'm not sure that's a great long-term strategy for building brand identity across your whole lineup. But here we are. The part of this that I find genuinely interesting, though, is that it doesn't have to be this way. The Maverick proved there's a market for something different. Rivian proved you can build a truck identity from scratch. The Tundra proved that being distinctive and polarizing is at least better than being generic and forgettable. So the tools exist. The knowledge exists. The question is just whether any of the major manufacturers is ever going to decide that the risk of genuine design innovation is worth it. And honestly, based on the current sales figures, I don't think they think it is. Which is a shame, but it's also kind of the most predictable ending to this story imaginable. Anyway, that's my take. Let me know in the comments which current truck you think has the strongest design identity right now, because I genuinely want to know. And I have a feeling there are going to be some very strong opinions. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe.